Hello, brethren. I'm Christopher Hodapp. I'm currently serving as the Worshipful Master of the Dwight L. Smith Lodge of Research under the Grand Lodge of Indiana in Indianapolis. I want to talk to you today about what I think is an important mission for Freemasonry, and I'm not kidding when I say probably the most important mission we've had since the early 1800s. So bear with me as I lay this out. About 25 years ago, historians started replacing the terms on historic dates of BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, with the more generic and obsequious terms BCE and ACE, before and after the Common Era. Well, I think the calendars may change this year again, now that BC and AD have been freed up for new use, as before COVID and after the disease. Because this precise moment in history is when, quite literally, everything in the world changed for almost everyone, everywhere. This Masonicon is a perfect example, and I don't like it one bit that I'm in my living room right now and not in that big, beautiful Masonic temple filled with the brotherhood and companionship of a couple of hundred like-minded Masons. In short, it stinks. But it's also clarified some things in my head this particular summer. You know, I used to get up and tout the notion that lodges needed to get more serious and studious. I was part of that amen corner who carped about cold spaghetti on paper plates and bingo nights. I knew that card parties and chili cook-offs and bowling nights and funny shirt meetings had their appeal in less serious lodges, but formal observant-style lodges where education went on all the time and great solemnity of ritual work, they were the real deal. And my tuxedos have been gathering dust all year long. But this is COVID year 0 AD after the disease now. Cities are on fire, people are screaming at each other, protesters are in the street of not just big city quagmires like New York and Seattle, but Kenosha, Wisconsin and York, Pennsylvania. Half the people on Facebook hate the other half, and they madly block and unfriend family members and lifelong friends over political differences that don't remotely affect their day-to-day lives in any way, shape, or form. Tolerance became a completely lost concept months ago, and all of a sudden the trivial conviviality and companionship of those card parties and chili cook-offs and bowling nights and funny shirt meetings, all of a sudden those are a lot more important than at any time in more than 60 or 70 years. If you're watching this on a computer screen or your phone right now instead of in the Masonic Hall with its small audience, I think you know exactly what I mean. Between the virus, the shutdown, the unemployment, the grocery and toilet paper shortages, the hurricanes, the wildfires, the riots, and the damn national election, I don't know about the rest of you, but I suspect the great meteor will finally wipe us all out just at the strike of midnight on New Year's Eve, just so we can say it happened this year too, and squeaked in under the wire. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Sherrard Roy was Grand Master of Massachusetts between 1951 and 1953. In 1966, he published a collection of his old speeches and essays called Dare We Be Masons? In one of his speeches, he said, quote, "First an idea creates an organization, then the organization chokes the idea. We can become so concerned about keeping an organization alive that we forget the ideas and ideals that give it birth. We begin by having a great idea that focuses our thinking and acting into new channels, and we end by serving the organization. Freemasonry must be a force to be used, not a form to be served," unquote. I was really struck by past Grandmaster Roy's premise, and especially his title from more than 50 years ago, Dare We Be Masons? I was struck by it because there's a deepening cultural divide going on right now that involves us as Freemasons, whether we realize it or not. Namely, it's that as our society has shifted so cataclysmically in recent decades, and in just a few short months, there's now a growing attitude by more and more people suddenly that asks, how dare we be Masons? Last year, there was an article in the Washington Post by a woman in her late 20s named Sadie Dingfelder, who visited the George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria. She knew virtually nothing about Freemasonry before she entered and learned almost nothing about it while she was there. She called the memorial nothing more than a monument to a bygone organization from a less woke age, because we're men only. It was a comment on how diminished Masonry has become in the collective American psyche. The Scottish Rite Northern Masonic Jurisdiction did a survey about 4 years ago and found that 8 out of every 10 respondents had at least heard the word Freemasonry, but they didn't know what the heck it was. In that same survey, less than 30% actually knew what the values of Freemasonry were. And the most common question I ask by non-Masons under 35 these days is, what the hell is it you guys do? What's the point? New information is coming in now about not millennials or Generation Z, but the next ones. The iGens, the children born in the year of the Y2K end of the world year of 2000. Remember that? And ever since then, who have grown up with an iPhone in their hand. They're now just starting to turn 20 years old. Nobody wants to admit it out loud, but men today are increasingly lacking positive male role models. The nation's great human experiment with fatherless children and single mothers has been a prize-winning catastrophe. According to the Pew Research Center, 40% of all U.S. children are born out of wedlock today, and now 57% in African American families. Less than half of American kids under 18 today are living in a home with 2 married heterosexual parents in their first marriage, what's quaintly called a traditional family household. More than a third of all American children today are living with an unmarried parent, almost always single mothers, without a father or even a live-in male partner of any kind to help raise and educate children. And since half of all U.S. marriages end in divorce, the vast majority of mothers, not fathers, are granted custody of their children by courts. All of that directly affects us as Freemasons. Back when I wrote Freemasons for Dummies 16 years ago in 2004, there was still a reasonable chance that enough grandfathers from the World War II and Korean War era had been Freemasons in sufficient numbers that their grandchildren had at least encountered the fraternity at some point in their lives. Well, it's 16 years later. Fewer children today have full-time fathers than ever before in recorded history. And because Masonic membership has also steadily fallen since 1958, even fewer children have a father or grandfather to pass along older traditions like Masonry and numerous other important values. When you take into consideration all of this stew of statistics, it's clear that Freemasonry has a shrinking chance of being passed along to the current and future generations by many fathers, grandfathers, siblings, uncles, or just plain influential men in their lives. In other words, there's no statistically significant reason why Sadie Dingfelder would have encountered Freemasons in her family. She didn't mention any sort of family connection to the fraternity in her article, so the only way she knows anything at all about us is from what she picked up by cultural references she's encountered as a teenager and adult, like going to the George Washington Masonic Memorial, poking around on the internet, seeing the Simpsons Stonecutter episode or National Treasure, or catching a rerun on A&E or the History Channel or Netflix. I suspect she may not have a single living family member, friend, or acquaintance who's a Mason or was in recent memory. If she ever has kids of her own someday, what chance will they have as adults to inherit any sort of collective cultural knowledge of Masonry in another 20 years from now? Given her comments, I suspect she'd disapprove anyway. Note her comments about Masonry being from a less woke era, a colossally imbecilic adjective if ever there was one. More and more colleges are demanding the elimination of single-sex organizations on and off campus, like fraternities and sororities. This fall, campuses are being pummeled with pressure to shut them all down. Young people are being taught a dramatically different and arguably damaging version of Western and American history now than any prior generations. And the Enlightenment values, ethics, traditions, and institutions of the founders and important historical figures are being derided or ignored altogether. Our images of George Washington and Ben Franklin as admirable Freemasons don't carry the sort of positive influence and impact they had even 10 years ago. Plenty of people today argue that they're a negative among increasing numbers of people, and let's not even venture into the demographics regarding religious beliefs among Americans in 2020, or how religious Americans are almost uniformly portrayed in a negative light or just ridiculed by the pop culture and intelligentsia alike. Wholesale contempt for the past has become the current fad of our times in this age of snark. So more people in the iPhone generation are going to continue to demand to know, how dare we be Masons? Now, don't get me wrong, none of this is an indictment of anybody, because there's no single villain we can isolate and counter or argue with or just take out and shoot behind the barn. These are just simply the current circumstances we find ourselves struggling in as Masonic leaders of tomorrow. That's what we're facing going forward as we try to craft messages for the profane world, design our museums, write books, and sit for interviews with the press or A&E. The culture has shifted under our feet, and this time we find ourselves potentially tap dancing on a minefield. Now, for years, I gave speeches that were full of nothing but optimism. I told everybody, hang on, the effect of Dan Brown's novels was going to bring petitioners pounding on our doors, and Masons would sit out in the audience thinking, this guy is blowing smoke like the fruit trees are going bad. I spent 25 years in advertising, making regional and national commercials, and I'm always hunting for solutions. I'm a huge believer in promoting it to the outside world every chance I get, for a couple of important reasons. I'm a big believer in beating on the coffin lid when the crowd is convinced you're dead. But we also need to maintain or recapture our high standards as the rest of the world loses theirs. In the late 1700s, the Grand Lodge of Virginia first sent Masonic charters out into the wilds of the farthest western frontier in western Kentucky, and then through Kentucky into what became 13 other states eventually, to educate and unite a very small and disparate population of rough pioneers behind an idea of improving the world one single man at a time, binding them together as brothers in a shared vision of tolerance, faith, charity, and understanding. Likewise, the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania sent charters up the Mississippi River as soon as the Revolution ended for the very same reason, years before the Louisiana Purchase ever happened. During England's greatest expansion of its colonies around the world, they chartered thousands of lodges in every corner of the globe, not as a club for frustrated Englishmen far from home, but to help in their mission to bring enlightenment, civilization, and concepts of morality and equality to the most distant places on the earth without the religious or social conflicts that churches or political systems often brought with them. Masonry taught people all over the world to get along with each other. Founders who established the United States realized that the only way our unique form of government would ever function and survive the ugliest side of basic human nature was if the majority of its citizens were what they called habitually correct in their actions. All of them said over and over that America's ongoing success depended on its founding virtues of honesty, courtesy, responsibility, industriousness, marriage, and religious devotion of some kind among its citizens. Those were all foundations of what became known as the civic religion, and they were all passed on from generation to generation until about 50 years ago. What Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory, issues of citizenship and solidarity. American Freemasonry was designed to be part of that ongoing mission in this country, to teach our members to be functioning leaders and maintainers of a democratic republic. Our earliest American Masonic leaders understood this. In 2020, America and much of Europe are wildly polarized socially, politically, culturally, and economically at this point in time. The term in vogue today is tribalism, and the world is being divided into more and smaller constituencies with less in common, all clamoring for special treatment or rewards, all demanding rights without taking any responsibilities or caring how others are affected, much less learning how and why things happen. Demanding the destruction of institutions without any regard for improving old ones or building new ones. Western society can't survive without its founding virtues and ethics. But those mystic chords of memory have been severed, and that spells disaster as we go forward. Consider that Masonic lodges can still survive with fewer members, but successful democratic societies may not so easily do so without Masons. When the first Grand Lodge formed in England in 1717, it deliberately sought to unite feuding Whigs and Tory political foes, nobility and shopkeepers, Protestants and Catholics, a half a century after their Civil War. But the 1720s, Jews were welcomed in lodges too for the first time in English history. Tolerance, cooperation, and the emulation of those who can best work or best agree. We say that at every meeting, don't we? Deliberately neutral ground like a Masonic Lodge meeting that expects better, thoughtful, enlightened behavior from its members may be just the place to unite, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must else have remained at a perpetual distance. That's what James Anderson originally told us it was meant to be in 1723. That's still our basic mission right now, not charities or perfect ritual or Grand Lodge paperwork or title chasing or Masonic degree tourism. No, our mission really and truly is that hackneyed old phrase we parrot back year after year, making good men better ones. Because that's the only way you get a better world. But we can't improve the world if we can't even improve our own members or keep them coming back to Lodge long enough to even try. Even before the catastrophic psychological and emotional effects of the long-term COVID shutdown, sociologists were already saying that teenagers and younger children born since 2000 have lost crucial interpersonal skills, basic things like reading facial expressions or engaging in the give and take of rational, logical argument and reasoning. They're solitary, and the majority are single children with no brothers and sisters to interact with or develop those skills. 4 out of 10 live with just one parent, almost universally a mom. There was a recent article in Atlantic Monthly this year that talked about how high school students aren't getting involved with student groups anymore, which was where kids in the past got their first taste of taking part in meetings, keeping records like minutes, understanding basic things like bylaws, working together on committees, holding measured debates, voting and electing officers. The basic give and take of cooperation and compromise. They aren't learning it, and they don't want to. The suicide rate among teenagers has exploded by 70% among teenagers just since 2007, the first year the iPhone and other smartphones came on the market. And this year of the COVID shutdowns has made all those statistics and problems skyrocket. So many of our new members will be seeking something that our culture used to provide but lost the keys to the car for about 25 years ago. Like it or not, we've suddenly had a big, fat, awesome responsibility shoved onto our shoulders as Masons, and especially as Masonic leaders that have never existed before. That's now on your head and mine, because we're still here and we keep coming back every week as these guys cycle through our lodges. It's not fair, but now that family, faith, responsibility, courtesy, cooperation, civility, honor, and the other founding virtues are falling apart, you and I are on the front lines now. All of this is why we as Freemasons cannot further lower our standards any more than we already have, and arguably bring back some that have been dropped. These men will need mentors. They'll need real brotherhood. They'll even need the chili cook-offs and the funny shirt nights. Plenty of guys wonder just how trustworthy any of their friends are, or whether they can be depended on in a crisis. Freemasons offer something better, something stronger. The Lodge is where we experience the bonds of brotherhood that are stronger than most friendships. In Lodge, we find positive examples of manhood and how to behave as a man. Brothers are different. Brothers mean what they say, because brothers live by a code. And deep down, most men really do want to live by a code. That's why what we take at the altar isn't an oath. It's an obligation. Don't let them learn ritual and everything else about Masonry from their phones or on the web just because they think it's convenient. Only a mentor can explain words and meanings, give them context, while being a close, lifelong friend and true brother. Only in-person human interaction can teach them the vital skills of civilization. We're stuck with the job now because society, families, schools, and other institutions won't do it anymore. So many of our future petitioners will be moral and spiritual ciphers, hunting something they can sink their teeth into that reaches into their heads and their hearts, and yes, their souls, without understanding why they need it. They just know, somehow, that they do need it. Our lessons are more important in these lunatic times than ever before, but men won't find what they need, and we won't have the opportunity to help them find it if they flee the building before anybody else has the chance to help them fulfill that I'm spiritual but not religious vacuum they recognize they lack.
And that's why we're important. And that's why I believe strongly in proactively telling our story to the world every chance we can. Generating new interest in Freemasonry without improving our lodges, though, is like saying I made your horn a lot louder because I couldn't fix your brakes. This COVID year will very likely be catastrophic when it comes to demits, especially from Masons who just don't see any reason to come back to lodge again after this year. My fear is that we could lose up to 25% or even more of our membership nationwide when the numbers get tabulated by next spring. Every year, we already lose more members to non-payment of dues than we do to deaths, and that's happened for a long time. Those are men who all came eagerly on their own and saw and left, sometimes in less than a year. We need to back off worrying so much about putting brand new butts on seats and start worrying about how we keep them there. The most important lodge meeting in a Mason's entire career is the fourth one, the next meeting after his Master Mason degree. It's the meeting he'll measure the fraternity by, the meeting in which he sees whether his lodge lives by the precepts they taught him in his degrees, whether he wants to come back, and whether his lodge wants him back either. I urge all of us this year more than ever before. Don't let brothers just fade away. Be the brother who cares and calls and visits. Be the brother who is the face of what is best about Freemasonry. When a man joins a lodge, we've got to invest in him. Give him some little piece of ownership of your lodge that's now his too. Whether it's giving him his first small degree part to learn, or letting him repaint the lobby, or tasking him with finding some artwork to hang in the lodge, or become a lodge librarian, or update the website, or find a guest speaker, or call all the widows, or cook dinner, or find a local school to help out, or even just be a committee of one. But for God's sake, can we please throw out that tired, backwards, victim-shaming, blame-shifting BS that says you get out of Masonry what you put into it. That bromide, throw it away. A lodge gets out of her Masons exactly what she puts into them and not one drop more. They aren't going to care about their lodge any more than their lodge cares about them. Your lodge can't just say, your check cashed, so welcome to Freemasonry, now give us your pants. Then just sit there and shut up until we want something from you. We discuss nothing at our meetings besides the problems with the plumbing and the boiler and only communicate with him after his degrees by sending him a dues notice at Thanksgiving. Then we've got nobody to blame but ourselves when he tosses it into the shredder, vanishes, and quits. We alone create the worst salesmen against this fraternity because they'll spend the rest of their lives telling their friends who ask about maybe joining the Masons too. They'll say, I tried it, don't bother. We rob ourselves too when brothers walk away. It's when lodges stop serving the needs of their members that they fail because no one has to come back to next month's meeting. If binge-watching Netflix movies are more interesting than lodge, then shame on us. And guilt is a lousy motivator. After you stay away for the second meeting, it gets easier every time. If a lodge is nothing but a place you dread, meet, and flee from as soon as the gavel falls, it needs to fix itself or close. Lodges don't have to be big to succeed. In Indiana, my Grand Lodge discovered back in the 1920s that when a lodge had more than 100 members, men regularly decided it was just okay to stay home because nobody would ever miss them. The bigger the lodge, the greater that feeling. In my state, it now requires just 10 Masons these days to charter a new lodge. It used to be 25, but we lowered it deliberately so we could experiment. Lodges don't have to be all alike. They just have to serve their members' needs for friendship, affection, education, philosophy, along with some fun and good food, of course. Honestly, we all weighed 110 pounds when we joined this fraternity, right? Even the very first speculative Masons in England formed their Grand Lodge not to bestow big titles on each other or practice ritual, but to revive their feasts. If you make something great, it never has to be mandatory. We've all visited those hospice lodges that would rather close and give up their charter than do anything differently. No Grand Lodge anywhere at any time in the history of the fraternity ever forced one single lodge to be a bad one or to give its candidates an unmemorable initiatory experience. No Grand Master or Grand Lodge ever demanded that a lodge have a crumbling temple, disgusting and broken furniture that should be cleaned and then burned. lousy ritual, terrible food with suspicious meat, prison coffee, and flat Sam's Club pop, no programming, no attempt at actual fellowship, cheap dues that doesn't pay the bills, but most of all, perfect proficiency at backstabbing each other in the parking lot. Grand Lodges can provide tools and advice. We've all come up with scores of them all over the world, just within my memory. But only the local lodge can demand greatness of itself and not become that most terrible of things, ordinary. Now, I asked my wife how many really great speakers are there in this world. One less than you think, she said. Never miss a good chance to shut the hell up, so I'll wrap this up. Brother Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French Masonic world explorer and author of the book The Little Prince, wrote, "If you want to build a ship, don't herd people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea." This little club of ours is supposed to be mythic, visionary, legendary, because your job, my job, is to teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea that is Freemasonry, every single day, even in COVID year 1 AD. This is my 21st year as a Mason. I'm a lousy ritualist, a decent researcher, and I hope I'm okay at turning a phrase every once in a while. But the idea of Freemasonry is still what I love, regardless of how it's presented. We have a mission before us today that is more important than it's been in more than 2 centuries. But before we can improve anybody else, we have to improve ourselves and our institution. It's long past time that we started demanding better of ourselves once again and living up to the same expectations our grandfathers had for this fraternity. If we fail and this fraternity dwindles to the point of extinction, we'll have no one to blame but ourselves. Men don't join the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts or Illinois or Nebraska or a club called the Freemasons. They join to become Freemasons. They join because of the idea of what becoming a brother Mason is to them. I certainly did. You probably did too. I hope so anyway. But all these new members will never love Freemasonry until our own existing members love it first. Every single man who has ever knocked on the door of every single Masonic lodge, everywhere on the face of the earth, comes in with that longing for the endless immensity of the sea that is Freemasonry that I talk about, that dream of becoming a brother Mason. Don't let lodges become places in the business of wrecking those dreams, but of fulfilling them. When the men we already have want to come back and stay and can't wait to be there, and show up on weekends and in the snowstorm and after a lousy day at work when he has all kinds of much better reasons to stay home instead. But he comes back every month or every week when every single one of us longs for that endless immensity of the sea that is Freemasonry. Then we can go back to worrying about going out and finding more new members and fixing the troubles of the world, and not 1 minute before. Thank you.